Welcome to another episode of Health Science Radio, where we talk with researchers at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus about the ways they are innovating and advancing healthcare. My name is Chris Casey, and I'm the Director of Digital Storytelling in the Office of Communications at CU Anschutz. It's a pleasure, as always, to be joined by Dr. Thomas Flagg, our Vice Chancellor for Research.
It's good to be here, sir.
How are you today?
Very well today. Thank you.
We will be talking today about air quality, an issue that affects nearly all of us. And we'll be talking about the increasing problem of air pollution and the danger it poses to public health. Our guest is Dr. Fernando Holguin, a pulmonologist and professor of medicine and pediatrics in the Division of Pulmonary Sciences and Critical Care Medicine at CU Anschutz. He is the Pulmonary Division Head at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Dr. Holguin grew up in Mexico and became a physician in Mexico City. He moved to the United States to train in internal medicine, pulmonology, and critical care at Emory University in Atlanta. Dr. Holguin joined the faculty at the CU School of Medicine in 2016. He is director of the University of Colorado Asthma Research and Education Program, which primarily focuses on understanding how obesity and changes in metabolism influence airway function in asthma. Dr. Holguin is also currently serving as the co-chair of the American Thoracic Society and European Respiratory Society Task Force on Severe Asthma. He has authored or co-authored more than 170 papers and is internationally known for his research on asthma, COPD, and air pollution. Tom, would you like to take us away?
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this topic. So here we are, as you mentioned, the historic Fitzsimmons Building in the beautiful Rocky Mountain West. And many of us live in this part of the country and enjoy the outdoors and being outside. It seems to me over the last few years in our neck of the woods, there's been more and more focus on air quality and wildfires to some extent, but just more broadly. Is it safe to be outside? Am I in a high-risk patient population? Can a young runner go and run 10 miles safely today? Or do we have to cancel the track meet or the cross-country meets? All these different things happen. So it'd be very interesting to get your perspective. Do you think this is a local phenomenon? Is it more broad? Or what's been happening to our air quality in the Colorado area and more broadly?
So it's a great question. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I think it's both things, Tom. It's a broad phenomenon, but it's also a local phenomenon. Broad in the sense that Denver, like most other major cities, I think suffers from vehicle-induced air pollution and other emission sources. So we have a high ozone particulate days like most places, particularly in the summer when it's hot, and in the winter, particulate matter when it's cold. But we also get this additional exposure that comes from the forest fires that bring a very heavy exposure in terms of particulate matter. Now, particulate matter it's small particles that are many times smaller than a human hair that can come deeply into your lungs and cause all kinds of problems, including inflammation. Beyond that, Tom, one of the things that particulate matter does is not only affects the lungs, but it can affect your cardiovascular system as well. So these things have a wide range of health effects in human populations. So unfortunately, for Colorado, we have sort of a double whammy, both the city and the pollution that it produces and also what comes from the fires.
How do we measure air quality? And as we're talking about, you mentioned particulate matter, sometimes we hear ozone reported. How do we think about air quality and measure that?
It's a great question. The Environmental Protection Agency has a set of pollutants that they call criteria air pollutants that monitors pretty carefully. And we have national standards both for daily averages, for annual metrics that are thought to protect health. And this includes things like, particulate matter, both fine and larger particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, other pollutants. So those are monitored throughout the United States and in many different parts of the country. So many cities utilize that information to create these composite indices that are called air quality metrics that you can see through apps or on the radio or on the newspaper that you can use, because they usually use colors. So, for example, green, it's a great day to go outside and exercise. Whereas, if it's yellow, you have to be careful if you are particularly someone in a sensitive group, like you have cardiovascular disease or if you have lung disease. And if it's red, you may be one of those individuals that need to consider staying indoors where there's less air pollution exposure.
Let me build on one thing you just said there. So you talked about those green days, right, where the air quality is good. And we're going to talk about different, groups, perhaps the higher risk groups, those with cardiovascular disease or asthma. But what about a healthy person who wants to go out and run, right, on a particular day, and it's a yellow or other day, right? Someone that's not at risk with these comorbid diseases. How do you think about advising people in that situation, healthy people on a less than optimal day?
It's a very, very interesting question. And I think there's a question for which the public health systems don't have a great explanation in how to best protect people, because it's a complicated question. If you look at whether people get sick or not from air pollution, there's a lot of variable responses. There's people that are more sensitive to it and people that are not. And I'm talking people without lung diseases.
Right.
Some people have cough, they sneeze, their eyes get irritated, and in the same exposure situation, somebody else may have no symptoms. So I think it's important for people to think whether or not when the air pollution is elevated, whether or not they experience any type of symptoms. If they do, that means that they're more susceptible to it. And by that, I mean like a little bit of cough or throat discomfort or difficulty breathing. Those people should probably avoid exercising on high air pollution days. Now, if we get in situations like we did a few years ago where the sky was orange and we had massive air pollution coming from California and the mountains, when we get to those high degrees, Tom, it's probably advisable for everyone not to be exercising outdoors. So you have to use some degree of rationale and evaluating what the situation is on a day-to-day basis, which is not a perfect public health message, right? It's not a white and black phenomenon. You have to just see how bad it is and how you feel in relation to those exposure days.
I'm glad you mentioned the wildfires. Was certainly a phenomenon in the West, but I've had some colleagues the last few years in the East Coast, for example. They've experienced some of those similar sort of high forest fire sort of days.
And one of the things that pollution misses, Tom, that it's important is that a lot of the pollutants that we measure are we call background air pollutants. So they're in the atmosphere more sort of diffusely across a large geographical area. But there are other sources of exposure that are also very important, that are perhaps more dangerous, is proximity to the source. So, for example, people that are right next to where the trees are burning, or they're exposed to different kinds of particulate matter and higher concentration of carbon monoxide, it could be more dangerous. Or people, for example, that live near freeways and thoroughfares where there's a lot of traffic. There's very good literature about cancer, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory disease in relation to proximity to traffic. So these things are not one pollutant is not the same across the board. It depends on how you are in relation to where it is being emitted.
To go back for a second to the healthy individual, no lung disease, no cardiovascular disease. I think the message there is you have to sort of individualize it, how you're responding to the conditions at the time.
You do.
One question I've heard or thought about is, so it's a medium day, right? It's not a perfect day. It's not dreadful. Is it better to go for a jog, better to walk? Can the healthy person moderate their exercise intensity to help with some of the potential symptomology?
Yeah, I don't think we really know, Tom. The more you exercise, for example, a normal person like you and I talking in this room, we're sort of breathing in and out 6 to 8 to 10 liters per minute of air. When you go and exercise and running, depending on how fit you are as well, you could be breathing in 30, 40 liters per minute. So that by itself means that you're getting exposed to a much, much larger concentration of pollutants just by how much air you're breathing in and out of your lungs. So it would be advisable not to be engaging in very heavy exercises when the air pollution is bad. There is data, there are studies coming out, for example, from California, the 12 community studies where they showed that, particularly in younger kids, that high-intensity exercise during high ozone days was associated with increased risk for developing asthma, for example. So these things, they play along with each other. Now, for a particular person, what that particular person's risks are, is hard to tell.
And when people are out there and exposed to particulate matter, Fernando, and you mentioned some of the symptoms, they'll be coughing, or maybe they just notice it's a little harder to breathe. Can you explain a bit deeper as to physiologically what's happening? Is it like an inflammation response that's occurring in the lungs?
It's a great question, Chris. It's a complex phenomenon. So it depends on the pollutant, but for example, ozone, it's a very powerful oxidant. When it gets into your lungs, it's buffered by some of the pulmonary antioxidants, but it can cause damage, and that could lead to acute inflammation and changes in airway caliber, which is called by feeling a little bit of wheezy or chest tightness in people, particularly people with sensitive disease. But they're also more of after a high air pollution day, if you look at the epidemiology, the number of emergency room visits related to that event can occur on the day, but also days later. which means that, you go and you exercise and you start to build some degree of inflammation that can lead to disease manifestation even a few days later. And so it's a complex phenomenon of inflammation and oxidation, and how much air pollution mixture you're inhaling may depend on the type of symptoms you eventually develop.
And you touched on, people living near very busy highways, their exposure levels are higher. Could you touch on perhaps the issue of lung health, how it appears in health disparity situations? Perhaps like people who are living in more congested areas, maybe this is a social determinant of health, perhaps, issue. Is there research that elaborates on any of that?
Absolutely, Chris. There are a number of recent publications that involve redlining districts. So in the 1930s, part of the new initiative, some areas across the cities were deemed less desirable in terms of the government wanting to insure those homes. And so the people that were living there were predominantly minority groups. Unfortunately, that has not changed over the years. Many of those red zones continue to show a lot of disparities, predominantly minority groups that are economically disadvantaged. And the research shows that those areas are exposed to higher levels of pollutant, higher levels of average temperatures. So a lot of adverse environmental conditions that lead to more disease. Studies coming out of California have shown, for example, that exposures to pollution in these areas lead to much higher rates of emergency room visits for asthma and COPD, for example. So yes, so these are things that are, and people that live, for example, next to a highway have different socioeconomical situations. For example, the people that live further away and therefore less exposed. So these things are intertwined, unfortunately, at many different levels.
We've talked a bit about people that have certain medical conditions, cardiovascular disease, asthma. Are there other populations of people, old, young, and so forth, that are more at risk, or we have to take more precautions around air quality concerns?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Tom, anybody with lung disease, with cardiovascular disease, but also people at the extremes of ages are people that are more susceptible to air pollution. But even some things that you wouldn't necessarily sort of off the top would consider as risk factors that put you at a different level of being more susceptible to air pollution. Things, for example, like diabetes, like obesity. These are things that have been looked at as potential comorbidities that could put people at higher risk of being exposed to particles, for example. So the more comorbidities you have in terms of number of diseases that you have, the more you could be affected by air pollution. And some of them may not be necessarily obvious.
And you spoke a bit about the process of the lung damage or injury that can occur here, so it can take several days to sort of manifest clinically. How about the other side of that, the healing process for those people that have undergone lung damage? Maybe they're in a smoky area for a prolonged period and have some inflammation or more chronic issues. Can that revert back to a more normal state, or how does that healing process occur?
It's a very good question. So there's data both from lung growth in children and lung function decline in adults. So for lung function, for both of those situations, the slopes of either growth or decline may be affected by air pollution if you're living in an area where air pollution is just a phenomenon that happens on a regular basis. However, if you move away from that city, and there's research showing that if you relocate, for example, your rate of lung growth or lung function decline can become that of a person that's not exposed to a high level of pollution. Unfortunately, that's not the case for most people. Cannot afford to relocate. And it has to be so it's not like a one day off thing. You would have to move away for a long period of time to sort of get the benefits of not being exposed.
It's interesting, just as an aside, so I enjoy history. I think about the history of our medical center and so forth. 100 years ago, people had come to the Rocky Mountains for lung health, right? Yeah. I mean, this place was founded here after World War I because of two things. Tuberculosis in the soldiers was thought to be at a higher elevation, but also the chemical lung injury that occurred in the trench warfare. It was also thought, as I understand it, they would get to the Rocky Mountains and the clear air up here would sort of clear and heal their lungs. Whatever that's true or not true, that's kind of part of our history of our medical center in this part of the country.
And it is what's ironic about it, Tom, now I'm hearing you talking about it, is that the higher altitude you go, you breathe faster because there's less oxygen. And so if you're breathing faster, to the analogy of exercising, right? If you're breathing faster and there's more air pollution, you're getting more exposure.
Because we're at a higher altitude, as I understand it, combustion engines have to work harder,
right?
And therefore they're emitting more pollutants. Is that
right?
I wonder, Fernando. So the cumulative effects, we talk about these bad air days, that people encounter during the summer, and they might try to hedge and avoid exposure. Is there a compounding risk there that they're going to do great damage to themselves just by the cumulative effect? And are we entering a period maybe where communities are just chronically at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the years, and again, it's hard to be very specific about it because I think there's a lot of variability in the degree of susceptibility that people have to these exposures. But studies have shown that, for example, years of exposure to diesel particles and things that are associated with, small percentual risk in the increase of lung cancer. But again, the exposure is more broadly, so it becomes a really large public health because it's not like smoking where, it's much of a greater risk, but less people are smoking. Here, everybody's breathing the same air. So even though it's much more smaller, in proportion, it's a major public health issue. There's very good data on development of chronic obstructive lung disease over time. So all these things eventually, for some people, will accumulate and lead to chronic lung diseases.
Is there any data out there about how climate change is, we've touched on things, but climate change could be contributing, like these ozone days that we have frequently in the Denver area? So
a lot of the ozone is generated both through primarily emission particle, but also through chemical reactions of particles in the air when they get exposed to sunlight. So there's primary and secondary generation of ozone. And so that's why we tend to have very high ozone days and through nitrogen dioxide, eventually ozone production. So that always is going to be great in the summer when there's heat and there's sunlight. And ozone will lead to all kinds of lung diseases and problems down the road. But also heat itself, independently of air pollution, associated with increased risk for COPD, chronic obstructive lung disease exacerbation and asthma problems. And global warming is a major problem for cardiovascular and respiratory diseases over time.
What can we do? What can individual people do? What can we do more broadly to try to curb some of the air quality issues we're talking about? Any sense of that aspect?
We can all both try to be more environmentally conscious and commute together, use public transportation, ride a bike, use an electric vehicle. We can there's ways that we can try to reduce our carbon footprint. I think that's important. From a protection perspective, it's complicated because we don't have great ways from a medicine perspective, like take this pill or take this vitamin or take this inhaler, it's going to protect you. The level of data and science is not there yet. So aside from being indoors and getting protected, that's really the only thing we can do for people that are very vulnerable. And that has issues that relate, Chris, to your question, because poor housing, for example, has very high coefficient of filtration of particles. We recently completed a study here in Colfax with children where we measured air pollutants in Colfax, both in many of the motels that are used as housing units in Colfax and single unit facilities, and found that very high levels of carbon-related particles get inside that are being emitted from just Colfax traffic. So if you're in a poor housing condition and you're telling a patient, stay indoors, that may not be as great as somebody who's living on a more affluent place where the houses are newer, well-sealed, air-conditioned, when the levels of ozone and particles are really lower inside. One thing that we can all do is don't smoke, don't vape, don't generate other things that are known sources of pollution directly to your lungs or to other people that are being exposed passively.
Those really smoky days we have sometimes, I haven't had too many this year, I'm tempted to put a mask on or just wonder if wearing something around my face would help if I'm out going for a walk or something. Do anything like on the individual level like that, those things help at all? Do you recommend them?
It would help depending on the type of mask. But if you think about it, Tom, that many of the particles that fine particulate matter that causes harm is 2.5 microns in air diameter. So, for example, a regular surgical mask is not going to protect you. You would have to have one of those K99 masks that are like below 2.5 micron protection, which is very uncomfortable to be using outdoors. Yeah. So for the most part, you go to a place and people are using the typical surgical masks. Those will only protect you to like large dust, pollen type of things, but not for diesel exhaust particles or fine particles.
That's probably really helpful.
Ozone for that matter.
It's really helpful to hear that. That makes sense, certainly.
With the advent of machine learning and AI, that's having sweeping effects on healthcare and research these days. From what you've observed, Fernando, is there any way that machine learning or AI could be applied to the study of air pollution and and its threat to public health and perhaps yield some sort of solutions down the road?
My short answer would be I sure hope so. I'm not aware of any literature, but I think it may be useful when it comes to a point of trying to understand from a larger perspective, how do we reduce what people call the air pollution emission inventory, which is how much like millions of gallons of pollutants and pounds of pollutants we produce, per unit of time. And I think that at the end of the day, the only way to successfully improve health is by reducing emissions. But unfortunately, you get to a point. This is the struggle, right? In order for industry and commerce to move, you generate pollution. That means that in order for us to come to work and do work, we are generating some level of pollution. So at some point, for example, the EPA levels that are assumed to be safe for human health, the relationship between exposure and disease is linear. So that means that there's events that are happening below those thresholds. But you have to keep the economies moving, right? But so the point is, to the AI is how little, in essence, with protecting the economy, can we or should we tolerate for human health? It's a very difficult question.
So you are a very active investigator and researcher and do a lot of work in this area. What do you think are some of the most pressing research questions that you're pursuing or the broader field is looking at right now?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. To me, I think a little bit about air pollution from a clinical researcher perspective. Like we should be doing more research trying to understand what level of interventions that are safe and affordable protect people directly. I've been involved in studies where we gave people supplementation antioxidants or omega-3 fatty acids and published those results and show some level of benefit to reducing, cardiovascular effects of pollutants or respiratory effects of pollutants. But many of those studies have been small and not replicated at a much broader scale. So it would be really nice to know, like listen, on higher pollution days, if you take X, your level of risk goes down. We need to understand even basic things, Tom. For example, I'm an asthma doctor. Yeah. And my patients ask me questions like, well, when there's air pollution days, should I be inhaling more of my medications? Mm-hmm. And it makes sense, but the data is very unconvincing that that's an adequate protection strategy. So it may not be the best thing to take people to take more inhaled steroids, for example, during high ozone days. We just don't know. It does not appear to be that's very protective as we thought it would be, based on some of our literature that we're coming out producing. So it's a complicated question. I would love to see more individual risk assessment for people outside the obvious trends, like people that are otherwise healthy, like some of the studies that are being done by Dr. Gerber at National Jewish, trying to identify common polymorphisms or changes in your DNA that could potentially put you at risk for different types of pollutants. Because then you can identify people much broadly that are in a higher risk category that they don't know it. And then maybe that's the kind of people you want to develop some interventions to protect them. But we're not there yet.
Has there been a lot of investigation into some of these home air filtration devices, or do any of those, I guess, individual home filtration devices provide any benefit in the research?
They do, but it has to be the correct one. Yeah. So there's a lot of air purifiers that work through electrostatic charges that you have to plug them in. Those typically are not preferred because they can produce ozone, secondary ozone generation.
Oh, interesting.
If you take a HEPA filter, which is what's in some certified vacuums, for example, the filter traps all the particles. So if you take a HEPA filter and you put it on a fan, and the fan sort of sucks air from your room and makes it go through the filter, it reduces overall the burden of particle exposure, especially in the room where you're sleeping. And data from our colleagues at Hopkins, Nadia Hansel, who's now the chair of medicine there, published nice results in people with chronic lung diseases that improves health. And those are actually fairly inexpensive to build.
Yeah, right.
They actually just took a large fan and kind of like put a cardboard box and attach a filter behind it and then turn it on, and that was sufficient to reduce burden of particle exposure. So it doesn't have to be something very expensive.
And I know you've done a fair amount of research into looking at the relationship of the microbiome, nutrition, and asthma or lung function. Could you talk about any particular highlights of the research you've done into that area and just how that microbiome could play into lung function? Or
yeah, it's a good question, Chris. Microbiome is obviously very complicated and involves or understanding not the actual particular bacteria, but the group of taxa of different bacteria. We have thought for the longest time that the lungs, particularly the lower airways, were sterile, but they're in fact not. There's actually there's colonies, there's microbiome in there, although to a much lesser extent than other parts of the body. Published results in the past showing that, for example, chronic allergy or certain types of asthma associated with lack of diversity of those microbiome, of those taxa, and so it can be associated with changes in lung function and outcomes. But we don't know how to necessarily manipulate it. So we know it happens, but it's a hard relationship to understand. What we do know is that changes in nutrition by way of people gaining weight or becoming obese is associated with worse asthma outcomes, less response to therapy, and also increased susceptibility to air pollution. There's very good data showing that obese subjects are more susceptible to ozone, for example, and that may be because they have more propensity to suffer from oxidant damage. So all these things are all linked together. Diet, people say that you are what you eat, you are what you breathe at some point. It's all combined.
It's interesting to hear about the microbiome. We think so much about that in the GI tract, but I guess less about the pulmonary system, but I guess it's an important component there as well.
It's an important component. And there's actually research going into what people call the gut-lung axis. So there's changes in the microbiome of the gut that can affect lung function. And that comes from, I'm not going into details, but we've put out research that shows that different types of microbiome produce different types of changes in your bile acid composition. And bile acid composition per se can affect the lung function. I mean, it's just all kinds of ramifications. So now there's undergoing manipulation. So whether or not, if you change your gut microbiome, you could improve lung health. I think that's not really known.
Interesting.
But an interesting question per se.
Yeah, the microbiome, it's something when it first emerged a number of years ago, became more of a research topic. You sort of wonder where it was going to go, and it just continues to be relevant, what we're doing. I mean, as an oncologist, I think about immune checkpoint inhibitors, like the microbiome, how that could affect some of these immune agents we're giving patients. And now you're talking about the connection with the lungs. So there's just a lot to that story.
Well, don't they say that we have more cells that are microbiome than our own cells? I mean, it's just that we depend on these colonies for health. So
I wonder if I could just state one thing at the end here. So we've talked about kind of like the take-home message, right? So let's think about those the healthy without any lung disease who are active. What's the take-home message as they think about air pollution and activity outside and exercising?
I think you have to, if you really want to minimize your exposure, try to exercise. If you look at the trends of air quality index in your city, depending on where you are and which season you're in, you can probably target your exercise in areas where there's less air pollution. So, for example, if you're in an area where there's a lot of ozone, typically the ozone peaks occur early in the afternoon for different cities. So you may want to run early in the mornings. But if you're in an area in which it's in the winter and there's inversion, you're going to have high particulates early in the morning. You may want to run later in the day. And there's a lot of apps where you can actually look at the trends over time. So you want to target, doing exercise in a time in which you're exposed less.
I guess the take home there is to be engaged, right? Think about the conditions, when's the optimal time, and just be thoughtful about it.
It's a reality of our time.
And the take home message for those that are at risk, how would you have them think about air pollution for those with asthma or other risk factors?
Yeah, like many of my patients have lung disease. If you're sensitive, most people know it, and most people sort of figure out that you pay attention to the news and when the air fires are coming or when air pollution is happening, and stay indoors. Stay indoors and stay properly medicated. I think another point, Tom, is to be well vaccinated because the combination of pollution having at the same time a viral infection can be a really bad combo for lung disease, right? So you want to minimize how those exposures work together.
Great conversation today.
Yes, thank you very much, Fernando.
Thanks for the invitation. Enjoyed it.
Health Science Radio is produced by the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Story editing, production, and design by the Office of Communications. A special thanks to Minnesota-based rock band Low for the permission to their song Especially Me for our theme music. This has been Health Science Radio. Thanks for listening.